The New Schools Network, for those of you who don't know, is a charity who is focused on improving educational opportunities, especially for the most disadvantaged. Since 2009, we have been a leader in promoting innovation and reform of the English state school system. We have supported the opening of hundreds of free schools, and we have championed the idea that every child, no matter what their background, should have access to an excellent education. Today, through research, events, and through the NSN Innovation Pilot Programme, we identify, support, and champion innovative ideas to improve education in the state system. And today I am delighted to be joined by a wonderful panel of Stephen Bush, the Associate Editor of the Financial Times, Estelle Morris, who was Education Secretary 2001 to 2002 and is the co-chair of the, you're still the co-chair of the area-based school partnerships. Excellent. And Lord Gove, who is the editor of The Spectator and was Education Secretary between 2010 and 2014. Our question today, and just briefly run out, I'll invite panelists to give their thoughts and then we'll open it up for discussion. And towards the end, do start thinking if you have a question that you would like to ask a member of our panel, because there will be that opportunity towards the end of the session. So, the question set, oh, and there are a couple of seats over here if you don't want to. No, not at all. It's much cooler inside, isn't it? The question today is bold reform or back to basics. What does the school system need? This week we have seen Alan Milburn's report, which highlighted that schools are neither supporting NEETs to get the opportunities they need, nor preparing people for the world of work. We have AI, which is promising to disrupt and revolutionize all types of industry, let alone education. What is it that school policy needs to make sure that it can continue to deliver for children as we go into the latter part of the 21st century? And I'm first going to go to Michael Gove.
I'm going to give a Boris Johnson answer. That doesn't mean evasive or prolonged, nor hilarious, sadly, but it does mean cakeist, because I think we need both build reform and going back to basics. So the framework, the background that Meg sets out is uniquely challenging. So we have a huge problem in our labour market, and that problem is most acute when it comes to young people either leaving school and not finding employment or further training. But it's also the one that afflicts recent graduates as well, who are finding that a very chilly labour market overall has become positively arctic for them. And there are factors driving that. There are broader economic factors, but exactly as Meg says, artificial intelligence, its looming impact, will probably only accelerate or intensify those trends. So what do we do? Well, the critical thing, I think, is that whatever the economic circumstances you face, there is always an advantage, what economists call the return to skills, to those who are the best educated. And the best education that you can possibly have to prepare you for whatever changes are about to come is an education that some people will dismiss as antique, old-fashioned, but I would like to think of as classically liberal. So you are better equipped for a world in which there is a greater premium on creativity and originality if you have already internalized mathematical, scientific, linguistic, and cultural knowledge to the extent that you yourself are adaptable, and in particular, that your brain is firing on all cylinders. One of the most striking gains that we've had in education policy over the course of the last 10 or 15 years is a better understanding about how our brains work, how people absorb knowledge, and how creativity is generated. And the key thing is that the neural synapses, the highways in our brain, need to fire and to connect. And they do so by deep immersion in knowledge, to the point where so much becomes working memory, and you're able to use that deep knowledge, the synapses having been fired, to be truly creative. And we've seen in the past, whenever there have been new waves of technology, whether it's been the internet or the establishment of what appears to be more democratic access to knowledge, that people have said, well, actually, do you know what? Now that you can find things in any library or at the flick of a switch, you don't actually need to know things, you just need to use knowledge. But all the evidence is that unless you have that stock of knowledge, you don't know where to begin. You don't know how to make connections. You don't know how to be genuinely, truly, intuitively creative. So in that sense, the entitlement that we put in place, a broad academic curriculum to the age of 16, is absolutely right. And the problem that we have is that not enough students have that. We introduced something called the EBAC. It was a measure of basic competence at GCSE level in maths and science, in a foreign language, in English, and in a humanities subject, history or geography. It wasn't mandatory, but what it was a signal, and a signal that this is what students should aspire to. And it wasn't a signal that was plucked entirely at random. We knew that when universities, they're not the be-all and end-all, were choosing students, that they would automatically, particularly the more prestigious universities, prefer students who had A-levels or qualifications in those areas. So it was both a way of firing up the mental synapses, preparing the neural highways, but also clearing the highway so that people, students, could have more choice later in life. Again, there's been a pushback with people saying, well, we don't want an academic curriculum, we want more vocational skills and all the rest of it. It takes nothing away from the mastery of vocational skills to hope that by the age of 16, people will have that bedrock of knowledge which equips them to be full citizens and to participate in a modern democracy when some of these big questions are asked. And that's why we've seen throughout history a war on knowledge and an attempt to evade the responsibility of educators and governments by saying, let's have a little less knowledge here, a little less stretch, a little less testing. It's all elitist. It constricts creativity. The truth has been precisely the opposite. And those people now who are talking about parity of esteem between vocational education and academic education should realize that if we want parity of esteem, what we need to do is not diminish the importance of the academic. It is make vocational and technical education harder, more rigorous, more ambitious. We should demand more from our schools and from our students.
Thank you very much, Michael. Estelle.
Well, in terms of the answer to the question, my answer is the same as yours, Michael. It has to be both. I agree with a lot of what you said, but I have a difference of opinion on some. But just, I thought, a bit of a context, because I think we sometimes forget this, that the generation of educators now, and of policymakers, and of citizens, are the first of whom it has been asked to raise standards for every child. If you go back one generation to when I was at school, I was at a grammar school, so you know the 11 plus, the way the system was set up didn't need and didn't call for the highest standards for every child because of the economy, and it's not worth doing that. So the enormity of our challenge is absolutely immense, and I think we have to remember that. And the second thing is that when I think of the enormity of that challenge, and when I think about what we know about what makes a good school leader, good teachers, strong purpose, good values, all those things, I can't think of another organisation in the world, probably, certainly the country, where that organisation is 24,000 separate units. So 24,000 schools, each needing an exceptional school leader to actually deliver high standards for every child. So that's the context where we are at this present time, with a generation of whom has been asked, raise standards for every child. And one child failing is just not good enough, because that's a life chance. And we're right, as Michael says, to demand the highest for every single child. But equally, in many other professions, if only one person failed, they'd actually have it as a success. So we're in the tough business in education. And I say that partly because sometimes I think we ought to recognise our successes more than we do. Because I've always thought that adults are no different than children, and you do need to know that your efforts are bringing about good end products and you are succeeding at some level. Because that's where the answer to the question becomes more of the same. Because for a lot of our children, we are succeeding. From the range of backgrounds, they're having real choices as to what to do with their lives. I taught for 18 years, and I still have my students come back to me. I taught in the inner city in Coventry, and I know where those kids came from, and I know the jobs they're doing now and the lives they've been able to lead. For them, it's succeeded. And I think what we've been doing for the last 20 years is because the system works for a lot, you have to make a decision. You have to ask yourself, should we make that system work for everyone? Should we drive it, push it in, thrust forward, go harder, go faster, in the hope that it will reach every child? And I remember when we were doing the literacy and numeracy hour back in the last Labour government, that we made really, really good progress very, very quickly. So the figures look really good. And there's a 20% at the end that didn't budge. And I can remember a conversation we had with the Prime Minister. And he said to Michael Barber, who Michael Gove will know because Michael went on to work with Michael, well, what do you do then? Drive it further, or do something different. And that's fine judgment. And just as a thinking aloud point, where we are now and why I might come, not back to basics, but why I might say rethink a little bit, is I don't want to be obstinate and so blind that I don't accept that maybe the model we've got as much from it as we possibly can. And that's a really, really tough question. It needs wisdom, it needs thought, it needs careful balance. But the reason I'm even prepared to think that, because I agree with Michael that without those qualifications, you deny choices. And that's not what education is about. But to be honest, if you can't get the youngsters in the school, and if you can't engage them, and if they're not motivated, despite the best teachers, and despite your best endeavours, I end up thinking, maybe I ought to be doing something different. And I'm not sure what the difference is. I've got some ideas, but I'm not sure of the answers to any extent that I would put them to you as potential government policies. But that's where I think we are now. Huge progress, huge success for some, life changed. I think we've got a good foundations. I don't really want to come back to this question, Meg, later on, but I think there's much more continuity of policy between the different parties in government than either will ever accept. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've got a relatively successful school system compared with where it was 30 years ago. But I don't want to close my mind to the needs of those children who we haven't engaged in education and for whom we really are failing. And for me, that's the agenda. And whether the answer to that question is more of the same or rethink, I think I'd like that conversation as a nation, let alone as policymakers and educationists.
Thank you, Estelle. That's really interesting. There are lots of points, I think, that's already been raised that I'd like to come back to. But can we hear from Stephen, and then we'll start pulling on some of these threads.
So I'm afraid I'm going to cheat and say I think actually the answer in some ways is neither, which is
Great.
we should... so what does the state school system in England do well? A lot more things than it did well 20 or 30 years ago. What does it do badly? And so what it does well, for example, is we have higher scores than ever in English and maths in the PISA rankings, but children are less likely to read for pleasure and they are more likely to experience stress and anxiety. So how can you secure and maintain those successes while tackling that failure? We have a curriculum, quite rightly, built around the importance of knowledge, but we also produce, if we think about the up-and-coming British musicians, artists, film stars, they are much more likely to come from private schools than they are from state schools. That is one of the ways we've gone backwards. So how do we have a curriculum that is open to creativity without a retreat to the kind of 80s and 90s, well, it doesn't matter if you have rigor in this school because someone will, the sort of what I think of as the Billy Elliot mode of education, where it doesn't matter that every other child in Billy Elliot's class is going on to have has no future in a dying industry, but don't worry, one of them becomes a ballet star. So how do you restore those creative paths without doing it? And then there's the distinct challenge of how do you, Estelle's exactly right that schools are these sort of diversified units, but they are also continually at this political pressure to be the solution to everything, because they are a thing that politicians feel they can pull a lever and something happens. And I think we're seeing that a little bit with the problem of the rising number of young people who are NEET and the rise of AI. AI slightly being used as an excuse for a bunch of things we know don't work in education policy. Like, look, to be real here, we've never asked teenagers to write essays about Pride and Prejudice because we were stockpiling for a shortage of 17-year-olds' opinions about Pride and Prejudice or persuasion. We were doing that to teach them knowledge and foundational skills. And I am increasingly nervous whenever I hear talk about how AI is going to change schooling and education, that it is a way for, under the guise of innovation and edtech, for rigor and high standards to fall back in a way that harms people who go to regular schools, whose budgets then go on fancy bits of technology, and I think we see this a lot in the discussion about education reform. We have kind of vocational training and AI for the excellence and learning for me. And I think that is a real risk and problem. And then, look, we do have a rising problem that entry-level jobs are being squeezed throughout the economy. My concern is that by expecting schools to become the solution to that problem, we, rather than fixing and refining some of those trade-offs with those improvements, we instead become, again, water down what it is schools are for, ask teachers to do things that they are, to be frank, not equipped for and never are going to be. And so that's why I think then the challenge for us is, how do we keep what's working, be attendant to what isn't working, without that being a backdoor to what's working? So basically, how do we find a way to go forward but not convince ourselves that actually returning to the old ways is actually forward motion?
Thank you. That was really, there's so much there to pull out. I think one of the points that Estelle made, but everybody touched on, is about the enormity of the challenge of striving for all. And I think, everybody has said that the school system's working quite well. I mean, we are, right? So England is performing particularly well internationally. We are the best readers. Our primary school children are the best readers in the Western world. This is all stuff that we should be really, really pleased about. But at the same time, there still exists an attainment gap where children from poorer backgrounds start school behind their peers, and that gap just grows throughout education. And not to be too simplistic about it, but in my mind, it begs the question, do we approach this are we looking at this from a deficit model point of view? Is it the fact that everybody should get something and therefore we must try harder and strive harder to make sure they get that basis? Or did that success only come about from having an aspirational model about what is possible in education? And then I suppose, because of the quality of the panel we have here, how does a government department turn that into actual policy? Anybody got a three-word answer for that one?
Well, I'm aware that I'm the only person on the panel who hasn't been Secretary of State for Education.
You've probably got the answers.
But I think, look, the challenge, in my experience of covering government departments, right, the challenge always is they all have an institutional culture. In that respect, they're like every other workplace, right? Indeed, everyone, like the FT has an institutional culture, the New Statesman has an institutional culture, the Telegraph has an institutional culture, and in order to make changes in any of those organisations, you are continually having to work out whether or not to go with the grain of that institution, or whether or not you have to have a maximal position in order to get it to change. Now, I feel, and I'm going to cheat and throw a question to others, that it feels to me that one of the challenges in being an effective Secretary of State for Education is that you're always pulling against a instinct towards, wouldn't it be great if, this kind of, vocational, what we mean is children from working class backgrounds can have worse outcomes, but it's fine because something, maybe they can become an electrician. And then therefore part of the challenge for politics is, I think, if you don't have that very aspirational target for everyone, you do lapse back to the model. It was Ellen Wilkinson who wrote in a memo when she realised the enormity of why grammar schools were a disaster for working class children, where she went, this awful platonic idea of, you have the gold children, the silver children, and the bronze children. And I think just as in a completely different policy environment, this is true in the Home Office, then if you don't have a Home Secretary who's willing to be very strongly liberal, they incline towards ultra-authoritarianism. I think if you don't have that aspirational leadership from the Secretary of State, you do get this gold, silver and bronze children. Now, sometimes the bronze children are vocational, sometimes the bronze children are SEND, but they are always, it always manifests itself in the same way with the same ultimate problem.
I think that's right. Interestingly, on the vocational things, one of the things I worry about most, there are some now really good apprenticeships around, and they're being commandeered by the children of middle-class parents. So what we have to stop saying that vocational is for working-class children. It's not the case any longer. And there's a real worry that every new initiative that comes along gets monopolised by the middle classes, that we are very good at doing it for our children and for those we love and care about. So I think that debate is changing. One thing I find strange, but I agree with you that in a way I think you could argue that that is the job of the Secretary of State, to be the aspiration. So if you're not giving that message, how can you expect the message to flow through the system? I think the problem is, certainly I was conscious that you gave that message and followed it up with a bit of a heavy hand. And I think sometimes I would have liked to have given that message and followed it up with a more nuanced hand in how we deal with things. I think one of the problems that we've not touched on yet is because of the structure we've set up, and I suppose this is one of the things I might think about if I was saying, maybe we can do something different. We say everyone has to do something by the same age. When I taught in the inner city, a lot of my children came from, in those days, it was Ugandan, Kenyan Asians. And some had come in what was then year 2 of year 3, secondary school at 12, 13, with no English. They didn't get O-levels at 16, but they got them by 21, and they were in university at 25. And I also can remember another group of students, white working class, who probably got very few qualifications, but what kept them in schools is we had a brilliant drama department and a brilliant sports department. And I would prefer them to stay engaged rather than me say you're banned from drama and sport because you've not done your English homework. And it's the judgment I made as a teacher. I would turn a blind eye to not having done their humanities homework because I just wanted them engaged in education. I wouldn't turn my eye to it as a Secretary of State. I couldn't stand up and make that speech because then the message would have been, we can all do drama and sport and we don't have to do English homework. And that's the complexity of the situation. But I do think this age thing we've got, we all know people, don't we, who've done well but done them to a different time scale than the system demands of them. And the problem, Michael, as you all know, is that we've decided our measurement should be at a certain age. So if the child does very well through your policies, but they don't deliver till 17, you don't get the credit. In fact, I got the credit for my predecessor's work, and my followers got the credit for my work sometimes. So I think that's just another thing in the mix. So another complicated answer, but my answer as a teacher would have been different than my answer as a policymaker. And sometimes we have to glue those together because both are needed, both contribute to the education services we need to build it.
I don't really disagree with anything that Estelle and Stephen have just said. I just add some things, and they may or may not agree with these, but I think they build on one or two of the things that Estelle touched on in her first set of points. So there's a lot that can be done to improve what happens in classrooms and with school leadership and organisation and funding. But it is also the case that there are a range of other issues that affect what goes on in school that also need to be attended to. So the first thing, as Estelle quite rightly pointed out and Stephen alluded to as well, is attendance. And we have had, there was always a problem with school attendance. It became much worse as a result of COVID, discuss. And I don't think there's anyone who's involved in education policy who regards the current levels of non-attendance as in any way acceptable or defensible or capable of being rationalised. How we improve school attendance, we can touch on in due course. That's one of the first things. And again, in the Milburn report, it points out that I think it's something like 5 or 10 days missed during GCSE year is a whole grade. The second thing that's linked to that is, of course, family circumstances. It is simply the case that, never mind how many books there are in your house, that's often a determinant of how supportive the environment is for a child. If you are living in cramped, damp accommodation, if a child doesn't have a room that they can have to themselves, not even their own bedroom, but, you know, clearing people out of the kitchen so that they can work at the kitchen table, if they don't have that, that also impedes their ability to learn. Then a culture of aspiration. I think it's overdone sometimes, the idea that parents don't care about what their children achieve. I think almost all parents do. But it can often be the case that parents are, because of life circumstances, addiction, depression, domestic violence, not able to be there for their children in the way that they would want to be. And that has an effect overall, too. So those are just three things, all interconnected, that have an impact on the ability of a child to benefit from even the best teaching and leadership within schools.
One of the stats that kind of hit me backwards from reading the Milburn report, which actually came from a DFE research paper from 2018, I think it was basically a child's GCSE performance is 84% determined by their life and 16% determined by their school. And you kind of think to yourself, wow, that is amazing. But there are certain things, I think, within school that can be done. You know, that's totally fine if all of that 16% is 100% all the time, right? But we also know that there is that diversity in outcomes where a child going to one school, say Michaela, to pick a free school out of the sky like that, you know, they had 100% of their students passed English and Maths GCSE last year. 100% of their students. They had a Progress 8 score of 2, and what that means, it's a very complicated metric that was pulled together. That basically means that a child going to Michaela gets 2 grades higher than if that same child went to an average school. That's amazing, right? My question from that is the free schools movement, something obviously NSN cares deeply about, has created some fantastic outcomes. But why is it that maybe the way in which those outcomes have got has not become ubiquitous amongst the system? What is it about these 24,000 units in their individuality which means that actually practice which is shown to be fantastic in one place is then not adapted and taken and then used elsewhere to hopefully get the same outcomes?
I think it would have been more... You described that, if I may say, as the successes of free schools. Yes. Now, lots of free schools fail. No, I'm just making a serious point. I'm not making a political point, honestly. Lots of free schools closed because they failed. If you'd have said instead, a school did this and it succeeded, why can't we run it through the system? I'd engage with you more. But if you say free schools did this, why don't we make everyone a free school? All I think of is the school. So there's a bit of a plea there to take the activity away from the politics, and I think that would make a better conversation.
And I'd like to have that conversation. I will just kind of plead that as a charity that was set up to promote and encourage free schools, it's somewhat written into my job description.
I understand that.
I understand that I have to champion the work they do. But I suppose the question, irrespective of the school, why is best practice, which is being fantastic in one place, then not taken up by the system and replicated?
Because it's the most difficult job in the world. That is the job of a politician. Politicians, in my view, in education, they don't invent things. They go around and see something that's working if they're sensible, and they come back and try to spread it throughout the system. And that gap, that movement from why it works there to can it work in 24,000 schools is the most difficult task in the world. And I think one bit is I don't know why, but in truth, it's because we deal with people. If we deal with widgets, or if we had to adjust the conveyor belt, or if we had a management theory, we'd replicate it. But I don't know about you, but I do better on some days than others. I'm more open to information in the morning than the evening. I'm better in morning classes than afternoon classes. I'm not replicating that for individual children is very, 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 very difficult. And I think the other thing that is difficult in that, the schools you described had really good leaders. They were exceptional leaders. I don't think you can develop a policy that absolutely depends on everyone being an exceptional leader, because it won't happen. You have to develop policies that will work for most of us when we're doing our job reasonably. Not when we're doing it badly, because we can cope with that, we can go in and intervene. The biggest enemy, to some extent, is most people's everyday practice. So the reason I think it's difficult is sometimes we don't know the elements that work. What is it you need to replicate? Is it teaching in the morning or the afternoon? Is it didactic teaching or group teaching? We're not good yet at working out what it is to replicate. And secondly, I think, and I don't understand this, that for a myriad of reasons, people respond in different ways. What I do think can happen, and what I think should happen, is we should be better at knowing what needs to be replicated and trust the teachers in different schools to build around that to meet the needs of their students. And in that way, I think we might make some progress.
I think the thing is there's always been a fascinating information transmission problem in education. So I think about, so the state school I went to was very, very good. One of the ways you can tell that is one of the places that Tony Blair visited on his farewell tour in 2006. Much to the chagrin of the RE teacher, we were deep cleaned all the way to one side when Tony Blair visited on his farewell tour, and then deep cleaned all the way to the other side when the Queen visited a year later. And you can still, I went back to do their sort of speech to the departing year 11s, and you can still see this square that hasn't been deep cleaned. And understandably, she's still quite upset about this. But right next door to it, there is a school which has now closed, and has exactly, it's not like there's a different type of British Bengali, white East Ender, mixed race, like middle class kid like myself, and like happens to go to that school and like had worse outcomes. But they just didn't do any of the things that, broadly speaking, we know works. Now, I think the advantage of free schools is just that because they are smaller, they are slightly more failure-proof, right? That if you think about, those of you who've got, who had children maybe in the 90s and also, go back and look at the good school, the good local state school that you wanted them to get in, and the one that you were worried they would get into. I mean, there was another school that my mother threatened to home educate me if that ended up being the one that I was sent to. That school's now very good, right? Because the head teacher's changed. And often the good school is very bad because the head teacher's changed. The vulnerability of local authority schools is that if your head of the local authority in times of vacation is good and they go, then suddenly 6 schools are terrible. Whereas if you're a free school, if a head teacher changes and they're terrible, only one is. And that is, I think, why they have been more resilient. But the difficulty, I think, for it as a political project is that no one, understandably, wants to deliver that message of, well, unfortunately, some head teachers aren't as good as other ones. And it's very hard to say that in a way which doesn't seem callous, because it obviously is a problem and it isn't acceptable for any one child. But the central issue is that schools are incredibly vulnerable to the failure of their leadership, because if you don't have a good head teacher, essentially nothing else can go right.
Michael, do you want to mention?
Yes, I find myself in a very strong agreement. I think part of it also is a political challenge, because on the one hand, the responsibility of the politicians is to say to the system, why aren't you doing as well as the best? Yep. But when you have a politician saying, in broad terms, our school system is great, you teachers are brilliant, we really love you, however, as soon as you get that bit, then people stop pricking up their ears, however, we can do even better. Yeah. And there are some people over there who are really showing the way. Yeah. It is just human nature to think, really? Are they? And to hear the criticism rather than the praise, the encouragement, and the path to improvement. That is just I mean, I know it myself. In my own personal life. People close to me, my family, will say, Michael, you're a great dad. We love it's always great to see you. But Fred's dad, at which point there's even though, of course, Fred's dad is doing a much better job. So it's just a psychology thing. And that's why getting the leader who is both challenging and empathetic is so difficult.
The irony is, Michael, that just think of your own school. I don't know a head teacher who didn't, at the start of term in the staff meeting, say, we did well last year, I think we can do better this year.
Yes.
When they say it, it's okay. It's when the politicians say
Yeah,
it,
exactly.
it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something in that as well about the fair criticism about the free schools movement, because ultimately, when you have innovation, you have the space for success, but you are going to have failures as well. And that I think, within public sector reform, is a really difficult thing for people to grapple with.
Yes, and on that, just two other things to add. One is that it is often the case, whichever the party, whichever the policy, that when there is an innovation and aspects of that innovation go wrong, people hone in on that. So the National Audit Office and the Public Affairs Committee are great people and they do a great job. But what they tend to do is to focus on the new thing and assess whether or not it's worked and mark it down. And then a failing status quo in whatever public service is just accepted as the way things are. And then the related point as well is, and it's more or less the same point, is that if you've got an impatient Prime Minister and you say it will take a little bit of time for this policy change to work and to bed in, if it doesn't appear to be, then it can be the case that the minister and the policy innovation go. So to take a case in point, and this is an example of something that worked under Labour, but not initially, that Conservatives, for different reasons I won't go into, didn't really get behind as we should. It's Sure Start. So the initial assessments of Sure Start didn't really show that it was making that big a difference. There were promising signs. It was only mature evaluation of it that showed what a difference it was making. And we can have an argument about how it might have been, whatever. But it was because a succession of ministers stuck with it. And then it was unwound, not as a deliberate act, but by restricting local government spending on our part. A mistake, I think. But it was only because successive education secretaries and successive prime ministers stuck with it during the Labour years that its fruits were being recognised eventually. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. And the same can be said for London Challenge. That I think one of the most successful things about London Challenge was that the government got the politics right. It managed to give the leadership that you were talking about, Stephen, but it managed to let them get on with it. And the best thing was there was no early evaluation that got into the public domain, because I'm sure it wouldn't have shown the success. It started when I was Secretary of State. We didn't start discussing London Challenge as a nation until 8 to 10 years later. And by that time, we could have that proper conversation. Just on innovation, Michael, because there's another... I think part of my reaction against the free schools is the assumption that there's no innovation elsewhere. If I'm really honest, innovation...
Which isn't true.
Yeah, is absolutely crucial. So I don't know why you'd restrict it to one type of school, but I think one of the best things you did was the Education Endowment Foundation, which is research. It's building up an evidence base for the profession, because it's never had it. I never consulted research at all to inform my teaching in 18 years teaching, because it wasn't there, it wasn't how I did the job. I'm glad my doctor didn't work along the same premises. But with the EEF that Michael put a lot of money into and is still going, it actually said to teachers in a controlled way, have you got an idea? Well, experiment with it. And if it went wrong, the house hadn't fallen down. But because it's smaller scale, it doesn't get the sort of publicity. So I can't keep my eye on the EEF, because I think it's a vehicle for innovation across the system. And maybe we should just keep quiet about it and give it time to flourish in the same way as Sure Start. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that the New Schools Network is doing is we run innovation. We've started an innovation pilot program, and the idea behind that is precisely to try and find and inspire innovation to happen. But importantly, we're working with an evaluation partner from the beginning to make sure that we can actually work out whether or not something works or not. Because one of the biggest things that drives education seems to be what happened before. And actually, to go back to the free schools point and not to make a political point about it, what free schools enabled people to do was start with a blank sheet of paper. And so it enabled them to use all of this increasing evidence that was out there to design something to really focus in on what outcomes do we want people to have, whereas to change an institution, as we've already discussed, is a much harder thing to do. And without the fact that we're not going to have multiple free schools kind of going forward, it's how we can take that spirit of innovation, which I agree with you is not it's not locked up in free schools by any stretch of the imagination, but we have to create the climate for innovation to succeed. And that's one of the things that NSN is doing through the pilot fund. It brings me as well to the other things which are needed within the system to support innovation. So from the innovations that you saw when you were Secretary of State, Michael, you saw Estelle, and from what you've witnessed, Stephen, kind of, do you think that there is a commonality that needs to exist within a system for innovation to thrive? And does that exist in the school system right now?
I think the central feature of for a school to be innovative is you need to have a head teacher who is both a strong leader, has a effective board of governors who support them and also provide scrutiny and challenge to them. And then, crucially, you need them to not have to spend their time having to manage up a bunch of unhelpful so I'm going to use a local example. Living as I do in inner London, where lots of the Labour councils, but now quite a few of them are Green councils, which is further aggravating the problem, have got really big into very, very strident anti-exclusion policies. Now, obviously, exclusion is always an individual tragedy. It always has very negative consequences. But in my secondary school, we had one exclusion because one child racially assaulted another. Now, the reason why is all of the stuff we know about how they had violent parents who were themselves in like the local national front, and that adult now has a much worse life because they were excluded. But I will tell you, and the flip side of that is that someone else who went to my school is the first British Bengali ever to be alderman of the City of London. So you've kind of got to have that trade-off somewhere. And I think one of the, and again, this comes back to why I don't think local authority schools are any worse individually at innovating, but they are more likely to have to deal with more noise from outside, right? They are more likely to have the Prime Minister's unpopular, and now your local authority is run by someone who has never been in a school before and hasn't been in a school since they were 16 and has vague theories about how to run it. And I think that part of the challenge is that no one wants the school their child is at to fail. But you only improve if you have the freedom to try things which don't work. Nothing has an 100% success rate for innovation, which is, I think, the thing that is currently missing from the school system is the ability for leaders to innovate without fear.
Yeah. I would say you've got to have permission to innovate, I think. I think you've got to know that if you fail, people understand and they won't blame you for it. I think I think in truth, the people who innovate are people who are confident and run good schools, good and outstanding schools. I once spoke to a head teacher in Sheffield, and she just moved to a primary school. I think something like, in some of the classes, 3/4 had just arrived in primary school from Romani background, because there's a large group of Romani children from Eastern Europe went into the Sheffield area. And it was really struggling, it was really hard work, and she'd come from a school that she'd already turned around. And I said, but I talked about innovation. She says, I can't innovate here. I said, why not? You've always innovated. She says, my teachers aren't confident enough. She says, this is about securing the basics, securing the basis, surviving till the weekend. And it suddenly made me realise that she was a head who had innovated, but she needed to be in a school that could cope with the failure of the innovation almost. And I think that's quite difficult. And the last thing I'd say, because I think it's a difficult one for all of us, you need to have time in the week to innovate. And I do worry that with this new curriculum review, it says it's making more time for more things. And I can't see where that time's coming from. And I think one of the conversations I'd like is, I believe passionately in the national curriculum, but I do wonder if it takes up too much time. And if there was a bit of time, I can't work it out in minutes, but if there was a bit of space where you could encourage innovation, knowing that the children would still get a good education from the rest of the week if it went wrong. So I would say it's space, confidence, and coming from a reasonably successful background.
Yes, I tend to agree. I mean, I think Steve makes a very important point about exclusions, and I think it links to a broader point about behaviour overall. So If it is the case, easier said than done, that you can have a culture of good behavior that means that disruption is minimized so that students can learn and teachers can teach, that is an absolute precondition for being able then to innovate. The second thing linked to that is the quality of the team. We often, quite rightly, praise exceptional head teachers, but the whole of the senior leadership team or others within the school, if they are motivated and working together, because as we all know from any institution or organization, it can often be the case that you have the cynic in the corner who's almost willing failure. Having a team that are prepared to have each other's backs is critical. That also helps with the behavior question as well. Nothing is more demoralizing in a school than if you have someone who is a teacher or a department lead who's attempting to enforce a culture of high achievement and good behavior, and they're not backed up. And sometimes they need to be backed up even when they make the tactical mistake and so on, so that their authority is not undermined. And then the final thing, and I agree with Estelle, is either look at the curriculum and consider what might be extraneous, or my preference, which is to lengthen the school day, to lengthen the number of hours that students have. At the moment, 1,265 hours a year is the mandated minimum, but you can't do that without extra money, to be fair.
And a lot of the things that were mentioned there, again, because of the freedom and the white sheet of paper that free schools started with, you have seen more of these longer school days, you have seen more kind of changing about, because I 100% agree with you, Estelle, that, you know, there is a ceiling on innovation, and the ceiling is the things which are zero sum, right? The time that you have and the resource that you have. And you mentioned the curriculum and the curriculum review and the power of the national curriculum. One of the freedoms that free schools and academies had was to deviate from that, and it kind of which has now been reversed by the schools bill. And I think it draws me on to the question, which is, you know, should all schools provide the same? Is it important that, you know, if I live here in Leicestershire versus, you know, Worcestershire or London, I can expect my child to go to a school and learn the same things? Or actually, does not doing that allow for people to take a specialism, to take a locality and run with it and thrive a bit more? What are the panel's views on, should we be delivering the same for every child, or should we enable difference?
I think that there should be a core, and that core, I won't prescribe the exact percentage of the school day, but I think that there should be that core, and then room for augmentation of that core. But I think that core is there in order to ensure that the choices that we make later as adults we're equipped to make, because we've got the confidence and hopefully the qualifications that allow more doors to open.
I don't disagree with that. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is a co-chair of the Working Party into Outcomes for White Working Class Children with Sir Hamid Patel. And one of the things we found from the evidence, which is there on the website, is the importance that white working class communities place on their locality. And sometimes they don't in our national curriculum or in teaching see that reflected. Part of the problem is they're not engaging because they don't think it's to do with their child's future. And it's made me think about it quite a bit while I've been looking at that evidence. And I do wonder, it's just an idea off the top of my head, I've not given it more than thinking about it to myself and talking to one other person sort of thing. But I think the national curriculum's important, but I do wonder if there's space for an agreed local curriculum as well. I don't know how you split it. I taught before the national curriculum, and I know a lot of my kids, even though I taught in a good school, didn't get as good a chance because they didn't have to do science and all those subjects right the way through the school. So I'm really nervous about loosening up too much on it. But I agree, I understand this bit of a local curriculum. And being educated in Coventry or Manchester or Birmingham or London or Norfolk should be slightly different. It should have a flavour of that locality, because that's pride in locality, and I think that matters. And I do wonder if we could find space for maybe a nationally agreed curriculum, a locally agreed curriculum. You know, you're going to have to have them sleeping there overnight at this rate, though, Michael. So, and a bit of freedom as well. The one thing I'd say is we as politicians can do that, but unless we show we value the bits we're not measuring, it won't happen. And successive governments have said, in 97, we stopped reporting Ofsted on things other than literacy and numeracy, because we wanted we wanted to give a message that they were prioritised, but we wanted to give space to teachers to work on that. What happened, we were going to schools that had done no PE for half a term. Because I learnt this lesson too late, that when a politician says they've got a priority, they've said two things. They said, I prioritise that and I don't prioritise that. And the teachers hear both things. So I think that, Michael, with giving them more space, that's the question I end up asking. You have to give a message that it's valued. Otherwise, the climate policymakers have created amongst teachers is that they'll put all their energy and their best teachers and their resource into the things by which they're going to be measured. And we don't have to measure everything.
I'm going to go to Stephen, but I'm just going to remind the audience I'll next come to you. So do think about any questions you have. Stephen.
Well, I think the global experiment about whether or not national curriculums are valuable is pretty conclusively in favour of having some form of national curriculum. The only example of a country which doesn't have one, which doesn't have terrible educational outcomes, is the United States. But when you split that out into individual states, it's an even clearer indication of it. However, I think one of the reasons why, in terms of one of the macro questions, which is, look, why have free schools produced successful outcomes for their pupils but not been politically as well loved as you would expect? I think it's partly because we've had a very useful experiment about how much of the cruft that's built up in the national curriculum, which, you know, when it was started in 88 was about this long, and now I wouldn't be able to stretch, if we had it page to page, throughout the whole of this building. And we learned through the free schools which bits of the national curriculum had grown too big, and schools which weren't free schools weren't allowed to take advantage of that learning, and instead we've kind of had the reverse problem where this incredibly prescriptive, you must follow everything, no individual variation for your pupils or their specific needs, has become the default for free schools as well. And I suspect that one of the ways that the free schools within the state system would have become more internally popular is if they were seen as not just vanguards but champions for freedoms for everyone, rather than freedoms for some schools. Because the thing I don't agree with her conclusion, but the thing I agree with Bridget Phillipson about is it is perverse to suggest that you have a national curriculum that only some people should follow.
That's really interesting. One of my favourite stats was there was a group that measured for a year about the number of times that a public body had called for something to be included in a curriculum. And it was something like 183 things in the course of 1 year had been requested by a campaign group X or campaign group Y, going back to an earlier point made that schools have to solve all social ills. Right, on that point, does anybody have a question for our illustrious panel? Hand straight up, just there. Do you want to shout it out?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me, and thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating and informative. Both Estelle and Michael be veterans of the ASCL conference. Whether they enjoyed it or not, I'm not sure. But just to highlight briefly two speakers who spoke at this year's conference. One was Bridget Phillipson, who spoke very passionately and very eloquently about her vision and aspiration for education for the future in state schools. And it was a very powerful and moving speech. My worry with the white paper is how on earth is she going to afford it? Thinking about your point, Michael, about attendance and about closing the gap, which is a difficult phrase, but nevertheless closing the gap. There were signs of that happening before COVID, and it's difficult to not underestimate the impact of COVID on children's attendance and aspiration, because it had a massive effect. So my question really in that area will be about how do we deal with the SEND issue, which is a massive issue going forward, and do it in a slightly more collective way than trying to do it in an individual way, which simply does not work. Another speaker at that conference, which had a big impact, was a lady called Katrina O'Sullivan, who I'm sure you've heard of. She started life in Coventry in dreadful circumstances, making the home that you described, Michael, seem like a palace. It was absolutely dreadful. And yet her resurrection sadly occurred in Dublin, not in England. But she did recover, and she's now a professor of psychology at Maynooth and is also an Oxford professor as well. So, but the one thing in her
Sorry, but we
story...
can get to the question. We're giving them 3 minutes to solve send,
Yeah, okay.
but was there another?
The one thing was Stephen's point about reading. That's the one thing that she had through it.
Reading for pleasure. Great. So the panel's views on send and how it's being dealt with in the white paper and reading for pleasure.
I think the send proposals are potentially really, really good, but it will need resource and it'll need time. So when I read the white paper, I like the approach to send, but I have the same worry as you that if we don't resource it properly, it won't happen. And I think we need to be patient and measure it as we go along. So I think I'm coming from the same place as you. It's one of those policies that we need to all get behind. And if we're looking to describe it as failing, or if we get split politically on it, I think we'll have lost a really good chance. So far, people have said, yes, that sounds good, but we want to see the resource. And that's a legitimate question for any commentator or political opponent to ask. But I'm prepared to go with it because, to be honest, I don't like the alternatives. Its values and its sense of direction are exactly where I would like it to be. So I'm prepared to give it a go. Sometimes, we talked about teachers taking a risk. Sometimes politicians have to take a risk. And there's a bit of me with the white paper that feels the Labour government is taking a risk. Because unless they go on to resource it and stick with it, it's not going to work. But I think it gives us a decent vision and a pretty good chance. And I'd like to think, I'm quite interested in that boundary between politics and education. And I'd like to put the implementation of the white paper into the education side and take it out of the political side. It's had the politics, now let's give it the educational unanimity.
I think one of the things in the white paper that we've definitely been speaking to a lot of the specialist sector about is most people are very pro more inclusion within school, trying to get more children with additional needs in schools if they've got the support there to help those children. I think the irony is we've got two things being true at the same time. We've got more children in specialist provision than ever before, and we've got more children with special educational needs in mainstream provision than ever before. And one of the things that we've recommended in our AP free school report is that we actually make sure that and we articulate the role that specialist provision will play as well, not just in their support of mainstream, that is important, but also their role as specialists themselves, because what a lot of parents want is for their children to be going to specialist schools, and we need to be a bit more dynamic in the growth in school places that are there, because in mainstream schools, because of the falling birth rate, we need to be a lot more dynamic in thinking how we can use those spaces to support with children with additional needs to provide specialist places. But sorry, I just grabbed the soapbox there. Michael, did you want to add anything?
No, I agree. Just two other things. I agree with the broad thrust of what Bridget Phillipson is seeking to do for the reasons that Estelle and Meg have mentioned, in that I think that at the moment the system, a system that I played a part in setting up, has created too many incentives for the people to aim for the golden ticket. Which is an education, health and care plan that means that you get a place in a specialist school with a lot of money, and then the incentive is for the local authority and others to try to deny that. So you have an ugly tussle with almost everyone losing out, and having a system whereby children can flourish in a mainstream school and have their needs met there, that is undoubtedly going to be better for everyone, better idealistically and economically. The only other thing that I would add is that I am sometimes irritated by the way in which special educational needs and disabilities are bundled together. And one of the things that I would welcome is a great degree of specificity and tailoring, not just in schools, that happens, but also in the public policy debate. Because there is a difference between children with severe learning difficulties, children who are living with visual impairment and hearing loss, who can, with the right support, completely succeed in mainstream settings, and then children who have behavioural and social difficulties, and indeed also the way in which that overlaps with children who have conditions, neurological conditions, who are on the autistic spectrum and who have ADHD, and each of these deserves to be treated with its own particular set of tools. Teachers know that, policymakers often not so much. And on reading for pleasure, I completely agree with you. I don't think that an emphasis on phonics and decoding early on inhibits that, but it has to be and, not or.
Stephen, we'll go to you. I'm just very sorry, but I've just looked at the time and we're not going to be able to take any more questions. Sorry.
So the challenge with I think phonics actually and reading pleasure exactly embodies the challenge with SND. In the introduction of phonics as the default has been terrific for children with dyslexia, and it means that many children who would have fallen behind, who would have taken longer to read, who might have ended up dropping out of school, now don't. However, equally, phonics can sometimes, for the third of children who basically will be fine regardless of, regardless how bad the teaching, regardless how bad the conditions, phonics has, in some cases, made the experience of reading more miserable for them. Now, for me at least, selfishly as a dyslexic, I'm actually intensely relaxed about prioritising the children who benefit from phonics. That's an easy trade-off. My fear with the SAND changes is whenever you say to a politician, we spend a lot of money now and very few people, essentially no one is happy with the outcomes, right? Parents aren't happy with them, local authorities aren't happy because it costs a lot of money, and the outcomes are not better than they were before the creation of the current system. But whenever you say to a politician, in the end we can do better for cheaper, their eyes light up and they go, we can do better for cheaper right now. You see this a bit with welfare reform, right? Where visibly our failures on adult and further education mean that we are spending more money on out-of-work benefits than we ideally should. But the government clearly really wanted to end run to the bit where they could stop spending money on out-of-work benefits. It was kind of like, and we'll think about the paying for it later. And my concern with the white paper is it's going to be a return, it's going to be the same movie again of, what if the solution that allows us to spend less money is just the fact of spending less money? And that won't solve the problem.
What an optimistic note to end on. I'd like to thank the panel. I think from today, what I've taken is we need to elongate the school day, and we need to back teachers a lot more. And if you're a politician, don't say anything as a priority because then the system goes haywire.
Yes.
So we can all take those learnings from us. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in the New Schools Network's work, please do come and speak to me at the end. I'd be very happy to chat to you about it. But before then, if we thank our panel with a round of applause, I think that would be fitting.